It takes a certain amount of ego and hubris to think that you can start a company that isn't going to die. The entire cornerstone of doing what we want to do well is consumer trust. And I couldn't do that by buying a bunch of consumers. My belief is that the CEO is the culture. It's like being a parent and how your kids are just watching you all the time has a huge impact on the culture of the family, right?
Welcome to the first official episode of Why in the Valley. I'm your host, Ashish, the CEO and co-founder of YML, a product design and engineering agency. While we are headquartered in Silicon Valley, I've never thought of Silicon Valley as just a zip code. It's a mindset, one rooted in innovation, experimentation, and velocity. Today, I spoke with Chen, the CEO and co-founder of NerdWallet, a service that unclutters the world of money and helps people make smart financial decisions. He has scaled NerdWallet to over 200 million in revenue and more than 600 team members. We discuss how growing up as an immigrant drove his curiosity and ambition, why you need both an ego and humility to start your own company, and how he has scaled his business. So with that in mind, let's jump in. Tim, welcome, man. I have been very excited to host you in Why in the Valley. We know each other over the past 4 or 5 years, and I have watched you build NerdWallet on the sidelines, going through the ups and the downs. I'm really jealous of one thing. You know what is that? Your man bun.
Oh, this is a quarantine casualty. I haven't been to a barber since February. So turns out it's easier to cut your own hair on the sides, but not the back.
Yeah, I was trying to grow my hair, and after 2 or 3 months of growing my hair, it just felt like it paused. There was no more growth after that. One thing which absolutely baffles me is how you have scaled NerdWallet to the level, more than 100 million consumers come to NerdWallet for financial help. And generally speaking, the kind of scale you have achieved, startups here in the Valley, they end up going to round F, E, before they get to that stage. And you've been able to do that profitably and get to that scale. So I definitely would love to unpack that. And, maybe we can start there. Like, why do you think it is important for you to scale profitably or responsibly? Like, why did you make that choice?
Yeah. And thanks for having me, Ashish. I think the right strategy for funding is probably different for every business. I think business is Darwinian, right? I think in the long run, what matters is if you have the right combination of, product, operational efficiency, et cetera, to really own a space. And so there's a lot of other entrepreneurs I talk to are probably more in winner take all markets where the right strategy is to just go raise a ton of money and just scale up much faster than everyone else and totally dominate a space. But I think in our case, I always thought a little bit differently about that. I mean, I think the entire cornerstone of doing what we want to do well is consumer trust. And I couldn't do that by raising money and going and buying a bunch of consumers. And inherently the conflict in our space was if you follow that strategy, you have to be hyper aggressive on monetization for every consumer. Otherwise you can't turn around and go acquire more consumers as competitively as everyone else. But the long game, I think in our space is really build a differentiated, trustworthy brand and then spend instead on things like building a better content library, building a more trusted product, and spin in channels more like brand advertising rather than direct response and try to build that up over time. So it was just strategically aligned to what we're trying to do in particular.
So Tim, I understand you grew up in Atlanta. One of my, favorite stories of you is the guy who sucked at bussing tables built a company of 600 people and growing very rapidly. So I would just go back, to your childhood and to unpack what kind of inspired you over the years to kind of embark upon the entrepreneurship journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this only becomes more clear in hindsight and in reflection, because when you're growing up as a kid, everything just seems normal, no matter how abnormal it is, right? I think one big thing as I was growing up is I just didn't really feel like things were totally fair. It's frankly a gift that a lot of immigrants kids have, where you just kind of have lower expectations of the outcomes that you can achieve. And you kind of feel like you have to work a bit harder to get there. But then when you achieve things, you're much happier because it's like that gap between outcomes and expectations, right? It's a very easy bogey. So I think like one of the biggest issues I think I ran into was just like, man, how do all these people around me in my neighborhood, at my school, how are their parents able to access all these opportunities and things that I just have never heard of or aren't enough familiar with? And so, yeah, in hindsight, that became a clear motivator for wanting to really democratize access to great information for everyone. Because frankly, a lot of the mistakes people make when it comes to financial services are just like waste. They're not things that help anyone, not the person making the mistake. It's just basically lack of information, lack of like power to the people. So yeah, that's a powerful motivating force.
I would love to know, how did you land on the idea of NerdWallet? And like, how did you get started? Any co-founders you had? Anyone who helped you early in the days?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was probably a remix of a few different things that I was seeing at the time. I mean, first, my sister asked me for help finding a credit card. And, I said, let me Google that for you. I thought it would take 30 seconds and I'd give her a response. And I was just kind of blown away by how not helpful a lot of the results were on Google. And I didn't really understand why that was the case at the time. But, I thought, hey, this should be easier to do a lot better. Let's make her a spreadsheet, right? Mm-hmm. So that was kind of like the first piece of it. I mean, the second piece was like, I had just been also talking to my sister about a company she had started maybe a year and a half prior. She built a coupon website called choose.com, and it was starting to do pretty well and reach hundreds of thousands of people. And so kind of mixing those two things together, I think I came up with the idea of just a really transparent, helpful spreadsheet to help people who are credit card shopping look for answers, right? With the benefit of hindsight, though, I think what it really came down to is there's a lot of financial products, there's a lot of consumers, and then there's these intermediaries that are really incentivized to steer you in one direction or another, and not necessarily to the best product, right? And so that can lead to a very sales-driven or very like sketchy feeling experience for consumers. And then so there's inherent in that conflict of interest a lot of mistrust, right? So even the name nerd really came from like, well, is there a quantitative, like objective way to like present a lot of this information? That kind of was the genesis of the whole thing.
When was the time like when you felt like this is a real business and not just an experiment?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it was all about extrapolation. I mean, I could see that this was going nowhere basically the first 12 months, because the only KPI that mattered was, are people showing up? Mm-hmm. So I'll take a step back. I mean, going into this, I said, wow, this is clearly a better way to access financial information. If I just put up this website, tons of people will show up, and this will be a great business. So, I built the first version in a few weeks. I put it up on the internet and 0 people showed up. I think I even made a Facebook post with, to my friends. And then I think like 3 people liked it. Like people just rolled their eyes. So that kind of highlighted the entire issue in the industry around it being so customer acquisition driven, right? I mean, there's just massive marketing budgets that are required to even get people to know that these financial brands and products exist, right? If big banks are spending over $1,000 to acquire a customer, how can little old me possibly get anyone to show up to my website? There's very little faith at that time. I think over time, I tried a bunch of things, and my next theory was that, well, if I could get reporters and journalists to see how wonderful this thing is, then maybe people will show up to the website. So I experimented with that, got over my fear of cold calling people and getting hung up on. Eventually, I think Money Magazine picked it up as one of the best websites, and no one came. Because you know what? When you read about it in Money Magazine, very few people will open up their browser and go to your website, right? And so at that point, I was kind of feeling a bit of desperation. I think only then did it really evolve into like, well, we really have to get good at winning Google rankings in order to even get a foothold to even begin to start to invest in this company. And so, over time, we started figuring out how to do that by getting more and more journalists and things like that to write about us. And that's when we started getting a foothold. But at that point, then it was easy to extrapolate like, okay, well, if we can just keep on growing traffic 20, 30% a month, in 6 months, I'll be able to pay a PR agency. In 12 months, I'll be able to maybe hire someone off Craigslist, et cetera, right? So that line of sight kind of started to become clearer as a steady flow of traffic came in and it was growing and growing.
When you say steady flow of traffic, like how did you sustain the traffic, right? Because I think that's kind of the most important thing where like, it's not just a one and done thing. There's this network effect. Like other people are knowing from other people, and that's a pretty heavy toll generally people pay, like to acquire customers.
Yeah, and I'd say in the first 5 years, pretty much it was driven by some combination of being in the press a lot due to our content marketing efforts and our Google rankings constantly rising. The last 5 years has been much more about things like brand advertising and word of mouth and people coming directly, right? So in the early days, it was really just about figuring out the mechanics, how to work with reporters, how to get content marketing to be effective, and then kind of this enduring rise in Google rankings.
So Tim, like you're at a stage where you're now acquiring other companies. I would love to know like what over the past 11 years, you've been building NerdWallet. If you have to, give distinct big chapters, right? Like, I guess your role has evolved, the product has evolved, the company has evolved. What would be kind of like those big chapters, if you will?
Yeah, I'd say the first chapter for us was really just getting a foothold. That means getting to the point where you have enough confidence not to quit and go find a job, right? At that stage, it was really just like 1, 2, then 3 people, right? I think just completely different sense of what mattered, how we operated together, different level of communication needed. Maybe basketball is the best analogy. It's like playing street ball one-on-one, right? It's like you better figure out how to do everything. You better figure out how to do everything well just to be able to live to the next phase, right? After we got that foothold, which I would define as like, well, we can kind of financially sustain 1, 2, 3 people. Then it completely flipped to like scaling up that foothold. So that became like a very interesting phase. For us, that was maybe like 3 people to call it 50 or 60 people. And that was just maniacal focus on one KPI and reinvest. And in our case, because we didn't raise money, it was just really like reinvest everything we got into the highest ROI thing. I'd say like in that phase, the primary thing we looked for when we hired was probably more like people who could figure out the right problems to solve, people who are really good at prioritizing, what are the drivers behind this ambiguous problem that lays ahead of us, right? After that, it became this expansion phase. So it's like, for us, the first thing we nailed was credit cards and organic traffic. At that time, then we're like, okay, we got to expand into different segments. So we replicated the success in the credit card segment to like 7 other segments. That became a whole different animal. That was more about like, how do you get groups of people to work effectively together? And in hindsight, what we should have been hiring for was less, like the ambiguous problem solving thing and more like, there's people that are really good at influencing, communicating, leadership, organizational scale, collaboration, that kind of thing. That's its own set of skills, right? So my job shifted too, because, instead of being like a player on like a 5-person basketball team, I was like the coach, right? I had to figure out, which players to put in which areas. And then I'd say like the last phase, which is probably more recent, is been really about like, okay, now we're in a bunch of verticals. How do we layer in a bunch of different things at once? I mean, very different than our core competencies. We never had a big paid marketing effort. We never had a big partnerships effort. We never integrated a sales function, et cetera, et cetera. So then it becomes much more about like, okay, let's bring in people who have done it before. Let's put them in the right places and let's scale up that way. So
Tim, you mentioned focus on one KPI in the first chapter, right? Like what was that KPI?
Yeah, I mean, for us, it was really, we thought that the biggest avenue for traffic growth at the time was improving our search rankings. And then within search, there were probably 2 things that mattered a lot at the time. I mean, one was getting really high quality links to your site from high quality publications, whether it be the New York Times or the US government or places like that, right? So hence a maniacal focus on high quality content marketing efforts. And the second thing that I think mattered at that time was just the way people were engaging with your site. Like when they come in, are they finding what they need? Are they sticking around? Are they hitting back on the browser and going to the next search result, right? So, just a lot of investment in creating great content, iterating on that great content, thinking like a product manager about that content, not as someone who's trying to write a lot of content, right? And then, testing and learning.
So you talked about, how your role evolved, right? And a lot of founders actually struggle with that role evolution. You were obviously one person at the beginning and now you're close to 600. I would love to know, what are some of the most important things you've seen, how people have grown within NerdWallet? Like, what are the things they have exhibited which, led you to entrust them with more responsibility, promotion for them? Would love to understand more on those lines.
I mean, I think the hardest evolution was for me personally, right? I mean, it takes a certain amount of ego and hubris to think that you can start a company that isn't going to die. I mean, you have to be a little bit out there to even think that, right? The contradictory thing to that is if you don't gain a lot of humility and growth mindset, you're going to be really terrible at scaling this company once you're out of your comfort zone. Whether that comfort zone probably started off as one-on-one street ball, but you're not going to make a very good GM if you don't figure out a lot of different things along the way, right?
Yeah. And what are some of the things you're looking for when you're hiring?
I think my hiring has completely changed, but I'd say it's phase dependent. I mean, at this point, the main people I'm hiring are exec team members. My belief is that the primary role of an exec team member is to hire, inspire, and collaborate within the exec team, right? I believe that from an in-person interview, I cannot assess any of those things very well.
Yeah.
And almost by definition, they've done that exact same job somewhere else. Otherwise, I wouldn't be interviewing them as an exec, right? So I rely almost entirely upon references at this point. However, I'd say at a smaller stage, it's much different. I do think in an in-person interview, you can get a pretty good sense of someone's strategic thinking skills, how they break down ambiguous problems. Case studies matter a lot, for example, or mini projects. They can give you a great sense of how someone's going to do in a particular role. So it's been quite an evolution for me based on stage. I think if I were to go and start a 2-person company again, I would go back to the case study for sure.
Yeah. One thing which I would love to unpack is when you're building a company, you go through different stages and there are different points when certain people are pushed very hard, right? Because that's what leads to building the company. And sometimes, there's burnout phase in the startup or in the company, and some people are burnt out. And how do you kind of manage the fine balance between burnout and giving time off? And sometimes you're not pushing people one after the other deadlines, which are stacked for sometimes it can be as long as few months. Right. How have you done that?
Yeah, I guess our approach has been, we try to be pretty flexible with time off. I mean, I guess if I zoom out a little bit, I actually believe that burnout is less correlated to hours and more correlated to doing work that doesn't feel high impact or that is kind of frustrating and endless, right?
Yep.
One of my beliefs is that things should be easy, actually. It should actually be you should actually want to work a 16-hour day and feel energized afterwards. That's nirvana, for many people.
Which is also the reason founders have almost an infinite level of burnout, because they're just so invested that, they just don't experience that, sometimes.
Right. I mean, some of the most burnout I've ever felt is working a 4-hour day. Everyone's fighting. Nothing's getting done. That's the worst. Yeah. And then you have to, even 16 hours of rest doesn't get you recharged, right? So I don't know. I believe it's a marathon, not a sprint. I think systems thinking is exceptionally important. I'm more afraid of people not getting along and not being aligned than hours. And so I've tried to become very proactive about addressing stuff that's just not working up front, because the fear is burnout and frustration and attrition as a result.
Switching gears from building teams to building products. So when you are building a product, And when you're experimenting, I believe you said you did a lot of experiments. And what were some of the big experiments, which led to the growth of the company? And what were even like some of the experiments which you were like, it's not working and it's always hard to pull the plug. But what was that tell that, what, we need to cut this short?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess some inside baseball on the very early days. I mean, like one of the most differentiated things you can do in trying to gain search rankings 10 years ago was to get a bunch of links to your website from high quality places, right? And so we tried a lot of different things. I mean, there really wasn't anyone that was doing it well. I think some of the people within the company, frankly, invented a lot of the playbooks you see out there today. One of the things that I was really invested in that ended up being a terrible way to do this was to build a bunch of products that would be impressive to reporters, but not necessarily that useful to consumers, in order to get them to write about it. And it's not that it didn't work. It was that it was kind of a leaky bucket and a low ROI. So I built a lot of these things, and then, but you build one, you spend a couple of weeks building it, you might get one reporter to write about you. And it increased consumer benefit or retention because it's just, sometimes a more arcane problem, like, finding the best gas station near you based on credit card rewards that have gas rebates or whatever, and put in your credit card and it applies it to every gas station near you, right? Sounds cool, but it wasn't something that was really used by consumers. So one day an engineer was like, hey, Tim, this other effort is generating 10x the output in 1/10 the time in terms of links. If that's our North Star metric, like, why are you spending all your time doing this? And I was like, oh, you're right. I'm just kind of I'm not looking at the data, right? And then, so that's when we really changed our operational KPI at the time to, just be focused on the most simply stated outcome, which is just like links per effort, right? And so I mean, I think those KPIs and North Star metrics change over time. I mean, that was always just a means to an end to get us where we wanted to go. We knew that we couldn't build consumer-friendly products if we didn't have consumers showing up for free. But many things along the way were kind of like that, just maniacal focus on one thing.
What about building culture at NerdWallet? Like, how would you define the culture? And what were some of the moments where you had to actually pivot the culture a little bit, like as you're growing, and kind of like, how did you do it? Because I feel like that is one of the hardest things to do. It takes just a long time.
Yeah, I mean, my belief is that the CEO is the culture. I mean, not because they're the CEO, but because they hire the exec team, they reward and punish certain things, they behave a certain way. It's just so easily observable, right? It's like being a parent and how your kids are just watching you all the time has a huge impact on the culture of the family, right? For us, the things we had to change about the culture were really things I had to change about myself. I mean, one of them, I think, was confronting problems candidly and quickly. I think that was a big weakness of mine early on that I had to get a lot better at. But then as a company, we had an aspirational cultural value, which was candid and constructive. And, I think over time it became much more of a reality, but it took a while. Another issue we had was just becoming over analytical. At one point, we would case study all of our incoming employees. I would personally case study them on something that I thought was critically important at sub 50 people, but turned out to be way less important once we scaled and started hiring specialists, right? And that was really around the driver identification case studies. And so what ended up happening was there wasn't enough like disagree and commit. Like, let's just treat everything as a hypothesis. Let's build the organization to maximize hypothesis throughput. It became much more about like, let's have intellectual debates about everything, which I think is a terrible way for a large organization to gain velocity, right? Probably good to some extent for a small organization with very limited resources. But yeah, at this point, we're a hypothesis factory. So those two jump to mind.
And if I have to ask you, Tim, like over the years, you've seen ups and downs and you're at a very solid position today. What have been some of the most difficult decisions, you have made at NerdWallet over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say like, look, you're going to make mistakes growing a company, right? Sometimes you're forced to reckon with those mistakes, and sometimes you do it for long-term planning reasons. And ideally, you make as few mistakes as possible and you learn from them. But yeah, for us, we got over our skis because we kind of like built the organization the wrong way and hired the wrong type of people for the wrong type of roles. We had too many silos. So it's very hard to do cross-functional member engagement initiatives, right? Because we kind of needed buy-in from all different silos. So there were a lot of things like that weren't quite going right. I mean, at some point, it just required us to hit pause. We had to do layoffs in, I think it was 2017, and readjust a lot of those things. The hard parts about doing that, I think definitely as an entrepreneur, you can't help but, read what's on Glassdoor. You can't help but read what's written about you in TechCrunch. These are kind of like things that you just have to get over for the long-term health of the company. And so, of course, it's like super hard, the impact that has on the actual employees. You're afraid what it's going to do to attrition, to your management team, et cetera, et cetera. What I was surprised by coming out of that period was just, it almost seemed like everyone knew what had to be done and felt good about it and energized about it afterwards, as hard as it was. And then things sped up after that. And I'd also say that there was a lot of it really where I think everyone recognizes that only the CEO can make some of these decisions. And if things are harder than they need to be and the CEO is not making decisions, I think it loses a lot of faith and credibility across the company and leadership.
Yep.
And that became very apparent as well.
Like this year, going forward, a lot of the standards of how we work with each other, the systems of collaboration is going to change for good, right? Like, how are you all navigating that? What's the plan for 2021 where people are remote and how long you'll stay remote and how are you thinking of bringing collaboration back?
Yeah, one of the things I learned and internalized this year was just, the difference between bias and racism and oppression. I learned that, everyone's biased. We all have brains. We all have experiences. So we're all going to have our biases. Oppression is really, it requires someone to be in a position of power. And, as you think about, me, you, thousands of other CEOs out there or people in management positions have a lot of influence into hiring, whether people are being promoted fairly, whether the environments are fair at work, et cetera, et cetera. These institutions are companies. I mean, if you think about it, it's the most important institution for racism and oppression. I mean, someone may keep me out of a country club and it may be annoying, but, like work is where it really matters, right? In terms of economic opportunity. And so I do think that a lot of CEOs I talk to, and myself included, are really internalizing that. And I think that's also one of the reasons why you see it come up so much from employees at town hall. And it's like an expectation that your company is going to play a role in shaping the society we all want to live in, which is really just a collection of companies, right? Economically speaking. So that one's big. I mean, I think the second big piece is, I think there are a lot of assumptions and limiting beliefs about what had to be done in person and remote. I think some of it sure was like the stuff you hear more often, like about collaboration. But I think a big piece of it was also just like, gosh, if I'm a banker, it's a sign of respect if I show up at your office in a suit and talk to you, right? I think the current reality is like a lot of those norms are just being thrown out the window. I mean, we bought 2 companies this year. I've never met anyone there. I haven't met the CEOs in person, right? I hired a board member in Atlanta. She never probably would have joined a board if she had to travel out here all the time. Like the things that are becoming possible. I mean, telehealth, doctors are starting to get paid the same for a telehealth consultation as they are for in-person, and that's driving their behavior. I'd say diversity of workforce too. I mean, gosh, when you can hire from my hometown, Atlanta, or just anywhere in the country, you can pick up a lot of different people in terms of age, demographics, et cetera. So I think there's just a whole new world out there. I'm really excited about where that goes.
So going forward, NerdWallet is going to be, because I'm assuming you all are remote right now, right? Like, let's say, at some point the vaccine is going to come and like we will have coronavirus behind us. What's the plan then, right? Are you going back to the 4 walls of the office, or how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, I mean, we're going to give people the option, but I think what is unknown is how people react to the options. My prediction is that in America, there's going to be 2 distinct sets of preferences, right? There's going to be the people who want to optimize for quality of life, meaning I can buy a house, I can live a comfortable life. That's a lot easier outside of the Bay Area, right? And New York. There's going to be another set of people, maybe younger people, maybe people who, for personality reasons, just really love the dynamism of being in person. And I think they're going to gravitate towards 2 different sets of companies. So if I use just our own company as a microcosm, our sales team loves being together. They love being in person. I predict very sales-oriented companies in the future will probably have core in-person presence.
Yeah.
And then I predict most DevOps company, for reasons of scalability and cost, et cetera, and quality of life, are going to be distributed, right? And there's probably a bunch of people in between. So on balance, I think NerdWallet is going to be a lot more distributed than it was, for sure. I do think there's going to be pockets or functions that might be co-located.
Okay. All right. And any big plans in the future? Like, what's next for NerdWallet? And why did you acquire these two companies?
Yeah, I think a business is kind of just an idea, right? It's a combination of product, culture, brand, principles, and I think it's almost like a virus, right? And I see the NerdWallet virus is very applicable. Our packaging is very applicable to a lot of different areas of financial guidance, whether it's helping small businesses or helping people outside of the country. And it's time to find like-minded people and plant that flag and team up. And when we do that, we can bring our expertise to them. They can bring their expertise to us, and we can scale up and save on infrastructure and platform costs. So that's kind of the big idea. In particular, I see, Fundera, small businesses are a really hard segment. I mean, you and I were both small business owners. I don't know if you ever try to get a business loan or even shop for an IP telephone. Yeah. It's just you feel like you have to take a shower after some of these experiences, right? They're just not very helpful. So definitely hope to bring, some of what we do to that market. And, I think culturally, just feel super mission aligned. All the advice I get from people who have done a ton of M&A over time is that cultural alignment is important. And that always sounded so fuzzy to me. But, my takeaway now is there's distinct polarities in terms of business practice. So, for example, some people might be luxury, some people might be discounters. It's very hard to put two companies together that are on the opposite end of the spectrum. But in the financial guidance space, my observation is some people are very sales oriented, very transaction oriented. Some people are very relationship driven, and we're definitely on the relationship driven side. So for us, the easy matches are with other relationship driven companies.
Okay. So Tim, last question on NerdWallet is, how big is NerdWallet today?
Yeah, we're about 600 people, a couple $100 million in revenue. We're now spread out across the US and in England as well. So, nice. Yeah, I mean, it's exciting. I mean, I think there's a long runway ahead. We're still only at about, 50% brand awareness in this country. So a long way to go here, but also abroad as well.
We are experimenting with a segment here, and we'll keep it rapid fire, and I'll give you two options and you have to pick one. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's just, whatever you pick is the right answer. Okay. Strategy or speed?
Speed.
People or process?
People.
Experiment or research?
Experiments.
Apple or Google?
Apple.
That looks like that was a hard one for you. Musk or Bezos?
Bezos.
All right. Well, Tim, it was a pleasure having you on the show. Thanks for giving us a lot of insights.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. Thanks.
And that's our first episode, everyone. Thanks for tuning in and listening. Join me again next time as I talk to Pete Flint, CEO and co-founder of Trulia, which was sold to Zillow for $3.5 billion. Currently, he's the general partner at NFX. You can find Why in the Valley wherever you get your podcasts, available now on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more.